aware of a problem and for various reasons did not notify emergency services. Many times this was a case of particularly excavations where you have a contractor may break a line, and rather than notify emergency responders, they would typically reach out to call their supervisor. And so they would leave a message with their supervisor. The supervisor would call them back and say, what's going on? It's like, oh, well, we did this. And they'd say, okay, well, let me get out there and take a look. And they get there and scratch their head and say, boy, this is bad. We better call somebody. And so on, those kinds of things go. Delayed notification to pipeline operator was the second most common. And this is the same thing in reverse. Now you have potentially pipeline release. Either it is not recognized as such, or the local emergency responders didn't know who to call, or usually because they didn't know who to call. And so there is a delay then in notifying the pipeline operator, which translates into a longer duration of time when product is being released and additional damage. 6% of incidents we had on-scene coordination problems between the pipeline operator and emergency services. Many times these were communication issues. Most of the time we're talking about pipeline operators may have an employee dispatched to the scene, and many pipeline operators will send the closest employee. That employee may or may not be necessarily trained in mitigating the incident, but they are a face for the pipeline operator. When they get to the scene, they may not liaise with the right person in emergency services. Emergency services may not anticipate their arrival, and essentially there's a breakdown of communication on the incident scene. 9% are delayed action by the pipeline operator. That's a case where the pipeline operator may be notified of a potential release, or there are irregularities in their SCADA system which show there's a problem, but they are unable to diagnose that problem definitively as a leak, causing a delay in taking action to close down the pipeline. 13% emergency services on-scene problem. This is where the fire service fails to act according to good practice when they're on the scene of an incident. A classic example of that is failure to adequately investigate migration of natural gas in an underground leak, particularly in cold weather, right? You can get natural gas migrating along the path of the pipeline typically into the basements of surrounding buildings. And so you might have a case where you get a gas leak reported at a structure, you're standing at that structure, and lo and behold, a door or two down will explode, which is not a good thing. Pipeline operator on-scene problems, 3%. That was one case that was actually a pipeline employee who showed up at an incident and they didn't have the appropriate equipment to detect the leak. And then other deficiencies not noted above in 13% of incidents. And so what we're seeing the takeaway is that about a quarter of the time there's either a delay or something is going wrong at the scene of an incident. In some cases you have multiple things going on. And so these are complicated events, right? And they're very muddy, and they're very difficult to make sense of. And this is an area of research that we're involved in at the center, and so this project coincides very well to our interests. And so as an example of that, I'm going to play an actual 911 call from an incident, and then after you listen to the call, I want you to visualize I want you to guess what's the incident that you're going to be responding to. Okay, so this is what you typically get coming into your 911 center.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Yes, I'm driving on US 101 North, and I just drove through an area that smelled like natural gas, really strong. So I pulled over to call you and see if something maybe you guys could look at.
Okay. Do you know what area, like where you were near, or what?
Yeah, I'm looking on MapQuest because I pulled over at like a turnout. So let me see. Arroyo Quemada Lane. This is for MapQuest.
Hold on, there we go. Oh, here Vegas.
Okay, so I was on northbound 101, and I started smelling gas in that canyon area, just, right there before I pulled off on this Arroyo Quemada, and then called you guys. Anyways, I'm a air conditioning repairman, and I know what natural gas is.
Oh, of course. I'm just typing it down.
It was pretty strong. I'm not used to smelling that driving by here. So
Okay, what's your name, sir?
My name.
Okay, so how many say we're responding to a natural gas leak? Raise your hand. Oh, come on, don't be shy. Okay. Well, you're wrong. This is the first call reporting the Refugio Oil Spill, which occurred in May of this year, and that was down in Santa Barbara County, California. A gathering pipeline that went from an offshore platform to a storage facility due to corrosion developed a leak. Something on the order of 140,000 gallons of crude oil leaked out in an area adjacent to the ocean. The oil flowed following the natural topography into the ocean. It impacted a state park, fisheries, and wildlife. Subsequent to the incident, the regulatory body, the federal regulatory body, has cited the pipeline operator for inadequate records and planning. And this was a noteworthy spill. If you follow the history of oil spills, there was an offshore oil spill in a very similar area of Santa Barbara, and there's a lot of production down there back in the 70s, which had a big influence. Just to give you an idea, that's this is a state park, a lovely beach, and that's the impacts, obviously effect on wildlife, and then an extensive cleanup effort, which is ongoing. And it's just important to remember the cleanup from these events, and the oil companies or the pipeline operators take responsibility, they bear those costs. But these can be very expensive multi-year operations with a long-lasting impact before you get things completely restored. So the mother of all incidents here in terms of pipeline awareness and emergency response was in San Bruno, California in 2010. I assume everybody here, most people here are familiar with the San Bruno incident, or at least have heard of it. But what we're first going to show you, and this isn't the video, but this is a video basically taken by someone in the neighborhood. And we're going to let it run, and like most of these videos, you hear the people talking, and they're speculating about what is it that we're looking at. Okay, and so I'll just play the video. You can read the text at the bottom. San Bruno is just south of San Francisco, adjacent to the San Francisco International Airport. So this is the beginning of the incident. And you can see the fire service people, the radiant heat, starting to light stuff off all around the fireball.
Yeah, it must have been a plane. So sad, yeah.
But I heard boom. I was in the room trying to say, what happened? Go too close. I thought it was a big
You heard it? You heard the airplane?
I heard the airplane.
I heard a big boom, too.
I heard boom. I heard and boom. So I thought it was a big airplane.
Okay, so what are the people there, what do they think this is? A plane crash, right? It's near the airport. why not? And so eight fatalities on this incident, several injuries, many injuries, and a pretty sizable impact to the neighborhood. And so one of the issues there, this was a very interesting case because the initial reports that went into 911 center was that it was a plane crash, right? And so the responders on the incident for a long time thought that they were going to a plane crash. So PG&E, which is the Pacific Gas and Electric, the local utility, has been, I don't know a nice word for it, but they've been basically clobbered with multi-billion-dollar fines over this incident. And if you look through the NTSB report, there was an almost unfathomable breakdown within their operations center. Despite their SCADA system giving them irregular readings, and there was it's a little complicated. There was work going on at one of their compressor stations, and in the process of doing that work, they took some equipment offline, and so the SCADA system went blind at some point, and the system was overpressurized, and that rise in pressure led to the rupture of the pipeline. But once the emergency occurred, the pipeline operator themselves, despite having irregular data and everything else that had gone on, kind of bought in internally to the notion that it might be a plane crash. And they even speculated that, well, maybe it's a gas station that exploded and it's burning up there. And so what actually happened is an off-duty PG&E employee saw this, reported it to the control center, and came on duty. Now, of course, they had to go to their work location to get specialized equipment, and then they traveled in the midst of this environment, right? You can imagine with all the fire trucks, people trying to evacuate, made their way to the first valve and then the second. And while that was going on, there still hadn't been a formal recognition from within the operations center that they had a leak. And so there was a long delay there. Okay. There's nothing to say. That is why this study was done, and that's why the people were taking a look at this incident and the implications across the 30,000 plus fire departments, 10,000 plus law enforcement agencies in the United States. So local residents, despite the fact this pipeline was installed I think in the 1950s, despite the fact that it was there, it probably predated the construction of that subdivision. Residents, by and large, were completely unaware that there was a pipeline in proximity to their homes. The initial reports, as we said, were for a plane crash, and PG&E didn't recognize internally that they had a gas leak, and if it were not for the off-duty employee who mobilized, they actually ended up shutting the valves. If it hadn't been for them, it may have been even a longer delay in terms of getting those valves closed. And essentially, from that incident, as you can infer, the fire service really was in a purely defensive mode. There was no way they were going to be able to put that fire out until after the gas had been shut down. And of course, when the valve is closed, the product that's between the valve and the brake is still going to migrate out and burn. And so it's not an instantaneous process. And of course, the valves also are not like a garden hose valve, right? They're large valves that can take hundreds of turns to close. Oh, am I going backwards? I am going backwards. The remote was upside down. Okay, we've skipped there. Okay, so that's a transmission line, natural gas transmission line incident. Obviously a worst case scenario, a line rupture in the middle of a heavily populated and developed area. Okay, our more mundane, everyday distribution line incidents can also be catastrophic. The first incident you're going to see is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The second is I keep forgetting the name of the town, but that's from within the last year. But we'll take a quick look at those. The gas company was on the scene investigating a gas leak.